She never asked questions. That was the first rule she learned on her third night behind the wheel of the matte black sedan. The man who paid her never offered names, and she never wanted them. Her job was to be invisible, reliable, and fast nothing. More nothing less on this particular evening. The air was heavy with a dry heat that pressed down on the city like a secret waiting to burst. She parked outside the dim warehouse on the edge of town engine, humming softly like a held breath. She checked the time again, 9:14 p.m., precisely the way they always liked it. The warehouse door creaked open in the rearview mirror. She saw two figures step out, both dressed in black, one tall, one smaller, both moving with sharp, deliberate urgency. They got in without a word. Just like always, the tall one in the passenger seat, the smaller in the back sliding in behind her. Without so much as a nod, she could smell sweat and adrenaline, like they had been running or fighting or maybe both. And the silence that filled the car was louder than any words could have been. "Drive," said the tall one, and she did instantly with no hesitation because she had done this enough times to know that timing was everything. She took the back streets twisting through. Alleys and service roads like the city itself was guiding her every turn. Muscle memory, the steering wheel part of her hands now. But tonight something felt different. It was the weight of it, not just the silence, but the kind that comes from something. Unfinished, something still unfolding, and it sat heavy in her chest like a warning she couldn't quite place. They hit the freeway ramp fast, merging into late-night traffic with barely a sound. The city lights blurring past like streaks of neon. Blood! She glanced in the mirror. The smaller figure in the back now cradling something, a metal case no bigger than a laptop. Dented, scratched, and locked with two codes. She had seen all kinds of packages before. But something about this one made. The air colder inside the car, like whatever was inside, had teeth and was waiting to bite its way out. The tall one was tense too, more than usual, his right hand twitching near his belt like he expected something to come at them from the shadows. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was low, like he didn't want the words to leave the car. There was a change of plans. He said the original drop was compromised. They're waiting there now, red lights everywhere. We're rerouting north, to the old silo off Route 8. And that was all he said before falling silent again. But her heart had already kicked into a faster rhythm because the silo meant distance. It meant isolation, and it meant this job had just turned into something else. She didn't ask questions. But this time her mouth almost betrayed her, because she knew what the old silo was. A government relic abandoned decades ago, too far from the city to be found by accident, too well known among the wrong kind of people to be used without reason. And suddenly she wasn't driving cargo anymore. She was driving a secret, a ticking thing wrapped in shadows and locked metal, and the freeway behind them was starting to feel too open, too exposed, too watched. The road stretched out before them like a ribbon of secrets. Unwinding in the dark, the lights of the city had faded behind them, swallowed by the thick silence of the open highway. And still no one spoke. The tall man sat rigid eyes scanning every car that passed, while the smaller figure in the back kept one hand on the strange metal case, like it might vanish if they looked away for even a moment, and she kept her hands tight on the wheel, her eyes flicking from the asphalt to the mirror and back again. Her thoughts racing faster than the engine beneath her feet. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was wrong, the kind of wrong that curled into your gut and refused to let go, and she had learned to trust those instincts because instincts were the only thing that kept drivers like her alive when things went sideways, and right now they weren't just going sideways, they were heading for a cliff at full speed. The old silo wasn't a place you went to reroute. It was a place you went when you were ready to disappear, or when someone else wanted to make sure you did. She didn't know what was in the case, and she didn't want to, but she couldn't stop thinking about it, because the back seat felt colder now, like the metal was drawing heat. From the air, or maybe from the skin of the man holding it, who hadn't moved since they left the warehouse, his face hidden by the shadows, his breathing too calm, like he wasn't afraid of what was behind them or what was ahead, and that scared her more than anything else, because fear meant you still had something to lose, and calm meant you had already lost it. There was a sudden flash of lights in the distance, two high beams cresting a hill behind them growing larger too quickly, and she tightened her grip, eyes narrowing as she tapped the brakes just once enough to slow, but not enough to draw attention. The tall man turned sharply, watching the rearview mirror with the kind of intensity that made her pulse stutter. "She's not one of ours," he said quietly. And that was all it took. Her foot slammed down and the engine roared to life as the black sedan surged forward, cutting through the dark like a ghost with unfinished business. The chase began without a single word exchanged, the headlights behind them now weaving through traffic, gaining ground. Every second she swerved off the main road onto a dirt path she hadn't used in years, overgrown with weeds and memory. The tires screamed against the gravel and dust rose like smoke behind them, but the car held steady because this was her world, this twisting stretch of nowhere that she had memorized like a second skin, and as she drove, the land began to change, hills, rising fences falling away until they were truly alone, in the dark again. But the other car followed still too close, still too calm, like whoever was behind the wheel knew this place too, or worse, didn't need to. The smaller man in the back was whispering now, something rhythmic, like a code, like a prayer. But she couldn't hear the words over the pounding in her ears. And the tall man was pulling something from his coat, a sleek matte weapon that caught the dim glow of the dashboard and turned it into firelight. And suddenly everything inside the car felt sharper, like the moment before lightning strikes, when the air itself forgets how to breathe. Up ahead, the silo appeared a jagged silhouette against the night sky, broken and massive and waiting. She hadn't seen it in years, but it looked the same, untouched by time, forgotten by everything, except whatever secrets still lived inside its walls. She slowed just enough to swerve into the side road that led to the back entrance, overgrown and hidden, and barely wide enough for the car. The tires bounced hard as they hit the uneven earth, but she didn't stop. She didn't blink because something in her knew they had just crossed a line, and whatever was chasing them wasn't going to let them walk back over it. They reached the silo just as the second car crested the hill behind them. No lights, no sound, just motion and menace, and when she killed the engine, the silence that followed felt alive, thick with intent. The tall man leaned forward, whispered the next part of the plan, but she barely heard him. Her eyes were locked on the mirror because the other car had stopped too. Not close, not far, just watching and waiting, headlights still off, engine still running, and she realized then that whoever was inside wasn't in a hurry because they already knew what was coming next. The door creaked open with a sound that did not belong to this time or place. It echoed across the hollow field like a memory that refused to die, rust flaking off in pieces as she pushed it with both hands, her breath shallow, her eyes searching for movement in the dark behind them. The second car remained still, the engine humming low and steady, like it was breathing, like it was waiting. The tall man motioned her forward, the smaller one clutching the case close to his chest, now whispering, faster and faster, like the words were no longer his own. The air inside the silo was thick with rot and silence, broken beams of moonlight slicing through the high cracks in the roof, revealing dust that danced in slow circles as if time itself had grown tired here. The place smelled of old oil and rust and secrets. The concrete walls curved up and around, like the inside of a forgotten tomb. The only sound their footsteps on the cracked floor and the soft thud of her heart as she moved deeper. Inside each step, dragging her further from what she knew and closer to something she could not name. They reached the center of the silo, where broken machinery stood like skeletal remains, and the tall man dropped to one knee, brushing aside dirt. and grime revealing a steel hatch beneath the surface. She had never seen this before, had driven past the silo dozens of times over the years, and never once imagined it held something beneath it, something hidden, something planned. He pressed his palm to a rusted panel, and for a moment, nothing happened then. With a soft click, the hatch released, and the metal door slid open into blackness that felt deeper than it should have been. She hesitated for the first time, her foot hovering over the opening, unsure if she was still just the driver or if she had already become something more. The tall man looked back at her with eyes that held no reassurance, only expectation, like he had always known she would make it this far. Like this was never about the drive. It was about what came after. She stepped down the narrow stairs, the air growing colder with each descent, until it felt like she was breathing through cloth, like the darkness was pressing against her skin, whispering things she couldn't quite hear. At the bottom, the room opened wide into something impossible. Old computers lining the walls, their screens still glowing faintly despite the dust cables snaked across the floor, like veins leading to a single chair in the center, bolted to the ground with thick straps hanging from its arms, and above it a lens staring down like an unblinking eye. The smaller man stepped forward for the first time, his whispers stopping as he approached the chair, and with shaking hands. He placed the case into a metal slot at its base, and for a moment everything was still too still. Then the lights shifted from blue to red, and the hum of machinery rose from deep below them. The walls began to pulse faintly, like the building itself was waking up from a long dream. And the tall man was speaking now, but not to them. His voice low and calm, addressing something or someone through a microphone hidden in the wall. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tone was clear. This was a negotiation or a command or maybe a confession, and whatever it was, it made the hairs on the back of her neck rise because something was responding. A voice came from the speaker, not loud but present, like it had always been there waiting to be remembered. It spoke in a language she could not understand, and yet every syllable felt familiar, like a lullaby sung in reverse, like a warning written in blood. And the smaller man fell to his knees, clutching his ears, eyes wide in terror, or reverence, she couldn't tell, and the tall man didn't even flinch, only nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for that voice his entire life. And then he turned to her and said something that froze the breath in her lungs. He said, "The case is not a weapon. It is a receiver, and the signal has already been sent." And before she could ask what that meant, the entire silo began to shake, dust raining from the ceiling, lights flickering as if struggling to stay awake. A deep rumble rising from beneath the ground, like something massive had begun to move, something ancient, something not meant to be disturbed. She turned to run, but the door above had sealed itself shut. The panel now, dark, unresponsive. The second car still parked outside, its headlights on now, casting long shadows against the silo wall, and yet no one had ever stepped out from behind the wheel. The walls were vibrating now, not with sound but with something deeper, something that moved through bone instead of air, like the whole place had begun to breathe on its own, a slow, steady pulse that made her skin crawl and her thoughts scatter. She stood frozen at the edge of the hatch, staring into the red glow that pulsed from the floor below, while the tall man moved, with precision pressing buttons along the old console, like he had rehearsed this moment for years, like every step was part of a ritual, and the smaller man had curled into a ball near the chair, shaking like something inside him had snapped. "The signal is not meant for us," the tall man said, his voice flat and distant, like he was reciting a story he no longer believed in. "It is a call to something old, older than cities, older than nations, buried deep below this land, long before we ever arrived. And now it knows we are here." He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something behind his eyes. Not fear, not regret, but acceptance, the kind that settles in only when someone has seen what comes after and chosen to face it anyway. She Wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to wake up in her apartment with the sound of traffic outside and the taste of cheap coffee on her tongue, but the hatch was sealed. The air was growing colder and the lights were beginning to dim one by one. Like whatever was answering, the signal was getting closer, like its presence alone was enough to drain the life from everything around it, and the concrete beneath her boots began to crack tiny spiderweb lines spreading outward from the chair at the center of the room, reaching for her, like fingers made of stone. The smaller man began to chant again, not in fear but in rhythm, like he was trying to match the pulse in the walls, and it worked, because the red light brightened with each word. His voice echoing in patterns that made her stomach twist, made her thoughts stutter and break like his words were pulling something loose from inside her, something that had always been buried, something she did not want to name. The tall man stood, motionless now, eyes closed, hands at his sides like he was offering himself to the room or to whatever was rising beneath it. The metal slot opened with a hiss, the case sliding inside and locking with a mechanical clunk. And that was when the screen above the chair flickered on lines of ancient symbols scrolling past too fast to follow shapes and marks that looked more like wounds than writing, and behind it all the voice returned louder this time, layered deep and low like multiple throats, speaking as one. It spoke through the walls, through the floor, through the air. And though she still could not understand the words, she understood the message. It was not asking for help. It was answering the call. And then the ground split open. It started with a crack, a single sharp line that ran through the center of the floor like a scar, and then it widened fast, concrete falling away into a pit so dark it seemed to consume light itself. She stumbled back, nearly lost her footing, grabbed a rusted pipe for balance and watched as the chair, the cables, the floor itself vanished into the void below. The voice grew louder, then not angry, not pleased, just aware it knew her. Now, knew them all, and the lights blew out in a single burst, leaving only the soft red glow from the broken earth. In the darkness, the tall man stepped toward the edge and looked down without fear. "This is what we were meant to do," he said, and his voice was shaking now. Not with doubt, but with something closer to awe. "We were never supposed to survive this. We were just the keys in you," she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What am I?" And he turned to her and smiled. The kind of smile that meant nothing and everything. "You're the one who delivered it, and..." Before she could speak again, the floor gave way beneath him, and he was gone, swallowed whole without a sound. She fell to her knees, the silence wrapping around her tighter than chains. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking as she stared into the hole, trying to see something, anything. But there was nothing, only that hum, only that signal. And then a new sound began rising from the pit, low and wet and wrong. The sound of something enormous moving through narrow places, pulling itself, closer with limbs that did not belong to this world. And she crawled backward, eyes locked on the abyss, feeling something inside her begin to unravel, like the thing in the dark had reached into her chest and begun pulling. She turned and ran toward the hatch, slamming her fists against the sealed door, screaming now, but no sound came from her throat, like the signal had taken even that from her. Her voice stolen, just like her name, just like her purpose. And then behind her, she heard the first sound of it climbing from the pit. She ran without thinking, without direction, her boots slamming against concrete as the sound behind her grew louder, heavier, wetter. Something dragging itself from the pit that should never have been opened, something ancient that moved like it remembered how to crawl through fire and ruin and bone. The silo pulsed around her like a living thing, and the walls sweated with moisture that smelled like rust and ash. And the end of things, she slipped once, knees cracking hard on the ground, but she pushed herself up, eyes wide in the dark heart, a war drum in her chest. Behind her, the smaller man was laughing now, not in fear, but in something far worse. A broken, choking sound that echoed off the walls as he stood near the edge, arms raised like a priest. waiting for absolution, and the red glow from below lit his face in sharp lines, his eyes wide and empty and shining with tears that weren't tears. He said something, but the words didn't matter because she could hear it now, all of it. The breath of the thing, the shifting mass of limbs that scraped against the edges of reality as it climbed upward without a shape, without mercy, without form. She slammed her hands against the hatch again over and over, nails cracking, skin-splitting pain flaring, up her arms, and still it would not open, the mechanism dead, the panel lifeless, as if the building had already chosen to bury her with whatever was rising from below, and she turned because she had no choice, because something in her demanded she see it, even if just once, even if it shattered her mind and stole her name. And when she looked, she wished she had not, because the thing was no longer in the pit. It was here. It did not walk. It did not slither. It simply existed, occupying space. It had no right to take its surface, moved like 1,000 mouths, whispering in languages that bent the air, its limbs long and wrong and endless, dragged against the walls, tearing concrete like paper. Its center pulsing with something that looked like memory and hunger and light bent backward, and the smaller man walked toward it, arms open, body shaking, and she screamed. But no sound came again, only silence, only the sound of the signal echoing in her skull like a heartbeat that was not her own. Creature reached him, and there was no violence, only contact, and in that moment his body folded inward, collapsing like a star. His scream was not one of pain, it was one of joy, of release, of something being returned, and the creature absorbed him. Like it had done this before, like this was part of the ritual, and it turned then, or something like turning its attention, shifting toward her, and though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze fall across her skin like ice and fire, like memory and ruin, and suddenly she could feel it inside her thoughts. It showed her things not with images but with absence. It erased parts of her mind, piece by piece, showing her the shape of what had been lost. A planet burning a city beneath the ocean, a voice singing, to a dead sky all woven into a pattern that felt too large, too deep, and she understood then that the signal was not a call. It was a reminder, a song played to awaken something that had never really slept, something that had waited beneath the noise, of history for someone to find the right note and play it loud enough to be heard. She stumbled back into the shadows of the silo chest, heaving lungs burning as the creature moved through the room. Slow, deliberate, massive, and silent, dragging its presence across the floor like a shadow that never belonged here, and she remembered then what the tall man had said. They were the keys, and she was the one who delivered it. But that was not the whole truth, because she had not just delivered the signal, she had heard it, and in hearing it, something had changed. Not just in her, but in everything, and she realized now that it was not finished with her. Yet. A rumble came from above, sharp and sudden, and she looked up just in time to see the ceiling begin to crack, steel supports groaning as something shifted outside, something heavy moving across the earth like the silo was no longer the only place waking up, and for the first time she understood that the creature was not alone, that the signal had reached further than they thought, that this was not just the end of one place, but the beginning of something larger. And as the first crack of thunder split the sky above, she heard more voices join the signal. The sky tore open with a sound that did not belong to the earth, a low, constant roar like mountains shifting beneath oceans, like something that had never known silence was stretching for the first time in 1,000 years. The stars blinked out one by one, swallowed by a shape that moved without form, the world above her. The sky she had once driven under so many nights was no longer a ceiling but a door, and that door had been opened by her hands, her choices, her silence. She had always been just the driver, but she had brought this here, and now it was everywhere. The silo groaned under the weight of something rising above it. the creature still within it, no longer interested in her or anything else, as it moved toward the crumbling hatch, like it had waited long enough and was ready to return to the surface, to take back what had once belonged to it. And behind it came the sound of others' voices, not screaming, not singing, just existing in chorus, overlapping echoes of beings too vast to be real, but too close now to be ignored. And she knew then that the signal had not reached across space. It had reached across time. The earth shook again, not in tremors, but in rhythm. The same rhythm the smaller man had been chanting, the same beat the silo had been pulsing to. And she realized now that none of them had created it. They had only uncovered it like an old wound, like a scar buried beneath soil and silence, and now the earth remembered what it had forgotten. She crawled along the floor toward the stairwell, hands raw, knees numb, vision swimming in and out, like she was trying to breathe underwater, and every part of her body screamed to stop, to give in to sleep, to the voice that was still whispering in her bones, but something pulled her forward. Something quiet and stubborn and human, something that still remembered what it meant to fight even when there was no chance of winning. And as she reached the top of the stairs, the hatch split open with a scream of twisting metal, and she was thrown into the dirt outside, coughing, shaking, staring up at a sky that was no longer her own. The stars were wrong, twisted and stretched into new shapes like constellations that told different stories, ones she was never meant to hear and from. The trees came the sound of the forest remembering its oldest fear. She turned and saw the creature rising from the silo, now fully emerged its body, casting no shadow, though it blocked out all light, its limbs reaching not for her, but for the sky, as if answering a call, as if responding to something even greater that moved above and around everything, and her breath caught in her throat because it was beautiful, in the way wildfires were beautiful, in the way storms swallowed cities and left silence behind, the kind of beauty that was meant to erase, not to inspire. And in that moment, she knew why no one ever came back from this place. She stumbled toward the road, which no longer looked like a road. The asphalt cracked and pulsing like it was alive, like it too had been waiting, and in the distance she saw the second car, still parked, still humming, still untouched, and yet she knew now that no one had ever been behind the wheel, that it had brought something here or waited to take something away. And as she approached it, the doors unlocked with a soft click, like it was inviting her back, like it still remembered her name, even if she no longer did. Inside the car, the radio was on static at first, then a slow fade into a frequency that matched the pulse in her chest. And through it she heard a voice, not from the creature, not from the signal, but from something else, something far away and older, and watching it spoke with a calm that made her shiver. It said, "This is only the first opening, the first return. There are more, and you will know them when they come, because you are marked. Now you are the one who heard the call and lived, and there is no turning back from that. Not ever." She gripped the steering wheel with hands that barely felt real, the engine humming beneath her like it remembered the road, even if the road had changed, and she looked into the rearview mirror not to check behind her, but to see what she had become. Her eyes were her own, but something behind them was not. And she knew then that she would drive again, not away but toward the others, the ones the signal had reached, the ones who were waking just like she had, and that wherever she went now she would no longer be the driver.